All right, it seems to be getting to be about that time. Well, I wanted to thank everyone for attending today. My name is Evan Mooney. I am a second-year student at the College of Medicine at the OU HSC. And I would just like for everyone to please turn on your cameras for this quick introduction so Dr. Coon can see your bright and shining faces. During the presentation, you're welcome to turn the cameras off, but we'd just like to have a good face-to-face here at the beginning. All right, so to introduce our speaker, Dr. Thomas G. Coon received his doctorate from the University of California, Davis, and served on the faculty at the University of Missouri before he moved to Michigan State. While at MSU, he was director of Michigan State University's Cooperative Extension, a professor of fisheries and wildlife. In 2014, Dr. Coon joined and currently serves as Oklahoma State University's vice president, dean, and director of the Division of Agricultural Science and Natural Resources. As vice president, he was responsible for integrating the Oklahoma Agricultural Experiment Station, the Oklahoma Cooperative Extension Service, and the Ferguson College of Agriculture. These three entities embody the land grant mission that is the heart of the OSU Agriculture and include more than 230 faculty, 375 extension staff, and 325 support and administrative staff, both on campuses and in 77 county extension offices and 18 research stations across the state. And before we get started, if anyone has any questions during the chat or during the presentation, feel free to put those in the chat and we will address those at the end. Dr. Coon, whenever you're ready, feel free to take over.
Great. Thank you, Evan, and good morning. Thanks everyone for joining in this morning. And we're going to talk about food and agriculture, and hopefully you've had, something to eat this morning, so it isn't going to make you hungry, but or ruin your appetite, depending upon what part of the food system we're talking about. Anyway, it is a pleasure to be with you. I appreciate the opportunity to meet with you and to talk about some of the things going on in agriculture that really are responding to the changing climate. And also particularly how those relate to human health. So as Evan said, my background is, I think my background is important to state simply so you understand kind of the context and mindset that I'm operating from. I'm originally from Iowa, grew up in a small town, worked on farms, so was connected with agriculture really throughout my formative years. Went off to college, went to a small liberal arts college, majored in biology, and then went on to graduate school at the University of California, Davis, where I studied ecology. And my focus really has been on aquatic ecology, lakes, streams, oceans, you name it, and particularly focused on fish and fisheries, the systems that interact between humans and fish and their aquatic ecosystems. As Evan said, I've had faculty appointments at the University of Missouri and at Michigan State University and have been at Oklahoma State since 2014. So I don't present myself as an expert in animal agriculture or crops or anything like that, but certainly have worked with agricultural systems enough to hold the title that I do currently. And unfortunately, I work with some really outstanding scientists who are on our faculty and are really helping us better understand what some of the challenges are. What I thought I'd do is just kind of talk through a quick outline here. We'll talk a little bit about the relationship between agriculture and health, go a little bit more into that broader perspective of agriculture and the environment, how agriculture affects the environment, but also how the environment has an impact on agricultural practices. With that, then move on into some of the issues and opportunities that we have in addressing the changing climate and how that affects agriculture and how agriculture can not only respond to the changing climate, but perhaps also play a role in moderating that or mitigating some of the factors going into climate change. And then finally, just to step back and kind of talk from a perspective of health, One Health, really recognizing that human health is really a part of environmental health, ecosystem health, animal health, and so on, that they're all related. And so approaching any particular aspect of human health without considering the environmental context or the economic context really is prone to leading to faulty decisions. So first, just kind of an overview of the relationship between agriculture and health. And of course, what we think of mostly in agriculture is food production. And of course, that relates very, very directly to human nutrition. And so whether it's on the actual production side of in the various kinds of things that we produce, the grains, wheat, corn, and so on, or pulses, beans like soybeans or other beans, and legumes, the vegetables, fruits, dairy, meat, eggs, and so on. So very complex production systems that we have today, as well as what happens to that food as it comes out of the field, some of the food safety issues associated with that, whether it might be pathogens associated with the food that can be introduced into the food, or perhaps minerals or other contaminants that might get into the food from other than biological sources. It's also important, I think, to be mindful of how the food addresses nutritional needs from a human development perspective, certainly growth and development from the time of conception through the fetal period and through growth and adolescence and into adulthood. Nutritional needs for that growth and development is important to consider, often critical times for particular nutrients in the diet that we need to be aware of, as well as the need for maintaining organ systems and tissues and functioning, and then ultimately a source of energy. Food also has a tremendous influence on our immune system and how that functions. And so just recognizing that what we do in the food production world really has an impact on these other aspects that directly relate to human health. I think it's also helpful to think about this from the food chain perspective. So it's not just about there's a farm and there's a consumer, but there's a lot that goes on between the farm and the consumer. And so it begins with on-farm production, whether it's a crop or an animal-based product, storage and transport of that once it's been harvested. There are opportunities for bad things to happen to food in those processes. With respect to storage, for example, aflatoxins, for example, can be introduced from fungus in corn, for example. Corn is especially prone to that, and those aflatoxins then end up being really critical, especially for early childhood development. So it's important to be aware that we need to make sure that whether it's a grain that we're storing or a degradable product, animal protein or something like that, we need to make sure we have good storage, and that in transport from farm to processing or from processing to consumer, there are opportunities for bad things to happen to food in that process as well. The food processing itself, food preservation, also are areas that are extremely important to us because it allows us to transport food over perhaps great distances, hold food for long periods of time, but we need to do that in a way that preserves its safety and freshness. How does the consumer acquire food? I remember once traveling across Ethiopia and seeing mounds of maybe 8 feet high, mounds of onions, nothing but onions, that were waiting for a truck to come by to pick them up and haul them to the markets in town. And so, for the consumer, that's gone through quite a journey to get from the field to the mound, from the mound to the truck, from the truck to the market. And then ultimately that, the consumer may acquire it there at the market. So whether it's at a market like that or at a modern grocery store, that's an important part of the food chain. And then ultimately meal preparation. So what happens in the home as the meal is prepared, or in the restaurant as the food is prepared for consumption. So, how what we do in agriculture affects human health can be impacted at every step of the way along that food chain. And so it's important to be mindful of that. Stepping back to a little bit broader perspective about the environment, of course, agriculture has an impact on the environment, but also the environment is tremendously important to agriculture. And so I just kind of listed all of the factors that really relate there in that interaction between what we do in agriculture and the environment. So of course, soil is something that we're very dependent upon for growing crops. Whether the crops are ones that we've planted or perhaps natural ecosystems such as grasslands that we can take advantage of through our livestock grazing on it and so on. So but the soil is the base of that. Of course, water is important. Plants require water for them to be successful in carrying out photosynthesis, producing their fruiting structures or leaves or seeds, whatever it is that we're going to be harvesting from them. And of course, water is also important to livestock as it is to humans. The air quality is really important to be aware of. It can affect animal health in confined feeding systems, for example. And then, within the environment, nutrients may be available in the water, they may be available in the soil or from the air. But of course, there's a whole array of nutrients that are important both for plant production as well as for animal growth, development, and so on. So nitrogen is especially important. Nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, really critical. Some of the micronutrients, sodium, calcium, chlorides, zinc, molybdenum, a lot of other minor nutrients that are important at various points, say in the photosynthetic process. And then organic matter, which is basically stuff that has been produced, formed by a plant or an animal, and is going to go through some decomposition process, some basically a reduction process that will result in that complex organic matter breaking down into its elemental parts. We'll come back to that a little bit later when we talk about soil as an important aspect of our climates. Of course, the plants that we're interested in, our crops, are an important part of the environment, but also plants that we're not interested in, whether it's weeds or perhaps noxious plants. Animals, both the ones that we intentionally grow, as well as those that we'd rather not have around, that perhaps carry diseases to our animals or perhaps cause problems for the plants that we're trying to use, perhaps introduce diseases to them and so on. Microbes are an especially important part of this, both because they can cause diseases, but also because they're so important in the recycling process, breaking down organic matter, for example, and making those nutrients available to plants as they carry out their life cycle. So, and then of course, climate has a big impact on agriculture. Plants don't grow without solar radiation, or at least some source of light, radiant energy. Temperature has a big influence on what plants can grow, how their metabolism functions. At too cold of temperatures, they can't do anything. At too warm temperatures, perhaps they become stressed for not being able to get enough water, for example, through the plant. And then, of course, moisture is a function of climate as well. So kind of a basic ecology 101, perhaps, but I think it's important to just have stepped back and think through those interactions between what we're doing in agriculture and the environment. So climate smart agriculture is a term that's been developed over the last 15, 20 years that really gets at agriculture in relation to the changing climate, the increase in greenhouse gases, the effect that those have on increasing temperatures, but probably more importantly, the way that increasing temperature in the atmosphere changes the dynamics of air movement. Air is a fluid, and so through convection and other physical processes, temperature has an influence on how air moves, and it also has an influence on how much moisture the air carries in it. and how it releases that moisture. So, those are all some of the complex factors that we're really coming to realize and perhaps fear over the last few years with some of the extremes that we've seen in weather patterns, not only here in Oklahoma, but of course, really in our coastal regions and so on. So anyway, climate smart agriculture is just this notion that let's carry out our agriculture in a way that is responsive to and perhaps can direct some change in the dynamics of the climate. So first of all, I think it's important to recognize that agriculture doesn't work if it isn't if we aren't increasing productivity and profitability. So whether we're talking about a large corporate farming operation, or perhaps an artisanal farmer living in a small holder with maybe 1 hectare of land that they're growing some crops on for their family, it doesn't really matter if they're not able to increase the productivity of whatever it is they're growing and profitability. It's going to create problems for them on the microeconomic scale, but it also causes problems for us on a global scale, because we do have a need for more food and food produced in a way that is economically sustainable. So that first part of that, it doesn't sound like maybe it relates to climate, but it really does, because anything that we do in agriculture that doesn't result in an increase in productivity or is unprofitable is not going to be sustainable. Second of all, we want to make sure that both our livelihoods, how people make their living, but also the ecosystems that we depend upon, that those are able to adapt to, respond to, and sustain themselves through the changing conditions that we're experiencing. So that's what we mean by resiliency, being able to persist in spite of the changes that we're experiencing in temperature, rainfall, something like that. So in other words, how well can our production systems adapt, or how well can our transportation systems adapt to some of the other changes that are going on with our dynamic climate. And then finally, and most directly, and so I'm going to focus a little bit more on this third point, is what can we do to reduce greenhouse emissions, or how can we remove greenhouse gases from the atmosphere? Because ultimately that's what's really driving things here. And so let's focus on that, reducing and removing greenhouse gas emissions. First of all, we've got to recognize that we have to reduce the sources of greenhouse gases. And so there's been a lot of emphasis on that, of course, with whether it's moving away from fossil fuels or changing other practices. There are a number of ways that we can go about reducing the sources of greenhouse gases. Another side of that is it's an equation balancing problem, right? So if we have too much of greenhouse gases, and can we slow down how many of those, what the mass of those is that we're adding to the atmosphere? Can we slow that down? Then the other question is, can we remove some of that from the atmosphere? Can we draw particularly carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere so that we're bringing that down? The whole effect of greenhouse gases is in the atmosphere, these are gases that tend to absorb lower energy radiation coming off the Earth. So, we have high energy radiation coming in, light energy coming in, heat energy coming in from the sun, and as it interacts with our ground source, our water, our atmosphere, and so on, it loses some of its energy, and it reflects back off the Earth, and that lower energy heat, if you will, or radiation, is absorbed by these greenhouse gases. So carbon dioxide has the greatest impact, but methane is another important one, as is nitrous oxide, and then some of the fluorinated hydrocarbons that we have in the atmosphere. So what's happened, of course, what's driving climate change is the fact that we have increased the amount of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere dramatically, since beginning in the mid 19th century. So the Industrial Revolution had a huge impact on that. And of course, the use of fossil fuels was a driving force there. And so this is 2019, I think, kind of a status of how important these greenhouse gases are in affecting climate change and causing this increased temperature of the planet, because these gases absorb that heat energy and retain it rather than dissipating it out into space. So 80% of that greenhouse effect is coming from carbon dioxide. Another 10% is coming from methane, 7% from nitrous oxide, 3% from fluorinated gases. So that's kind of the elemental part of it, or the molecular part of it. Where are those gases coming from? And you can see that the largest source is transportation, or our addiction to fossil fuel powered transportation, whether it's cars, trucks, planes, trains, what have you, boats, ships, and so on. So 29% of our greenhouse gases currently are produced by out from the transportation sector. 25% is coming from electricity generation, 23% from industry, 10% from agriculture. Okay, so agriculture is a source of greenhouse gases. So if we can reduce the production of greenhouse gases in agriculture, that will help. At the same time, if agriculture can absorb more greenhouse gases than it is currently, that also can help. Then commercial and residential are smaller sources. I want to talk a little bit more about methane and nitrous oxide. So carbon dioxide is by far the greatest impact, but methane is actually more effective at retaining that heat in the atmosphere than carbon dioxide on a per molecular basis. Okay, so for a ton of methane in the atmosphere, it holds more heat holding capacity than carbon dioxide. So a little bit of methane is equal to 10 times as much carbon dioxide. So it's very powerful. So anything that we can do to reduce methane or remove methane from the atmosphere is going to have a bigger impact than every ton of carbon dioxide that we remove from the atmosphere. Nitrous oxide is even more effective, up to 300 times the greenhouse gas effect as carbon dioxide. Now, there's not very much in the atmosphere, but it's listed here because, well, 7% is a significant number, but also there seems to be an increase in that, and so some of that is related to agriculture. So again, there's some opportunities here in agriculture to address that source as well. So agriculture has an impact on all three of those to the right: the carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. And so I want to talk about that a little bit more. These are data from the EPA. The next slide just illustrates some of the more recent dynamics of these gases. So, and this is looking at it by the source from the economic sector, the same, the truck and the power plant and all that we had in the previous one. So transportation is the red on top, commercial electricity generation is the blue down below. You can see we had an expansion in an amount of greenhouse gas production by energy sector, and now by the electricity sector, and now that's starting to decrease again. That it's becoming narrower. So we're making some progress there. Industry, the purple, then agriculture is the green. On the right, you can see that from 1990 to 2019, there's been about a 23% increase in greenhouse gas production by transportation, about a 12% decrease due to electricity generation, another 8% decrease due to manufacturing, other industry. Agriculture is up 11.5%. So there's some need and opportunities for us to be responsive there and try to be better stewards so that we're actually helping to reduce the impact of our practices on the climate. And then the others, we see some changes there as well. So that's looking at it by economic sector. This is looking at it by, again, as the gas, the molecule that's causing the problem. You can see carbon dioxide is overwhelming in its impact. Methane has actually decreased by about 15% from 1990 to 2019. Nitrous oxide, very little change there, maybe a 1% increase. And then the fluorinated gases, a concern as well. So we look at what can we do to reduce and remove greenhouse gas emissions from the atmosphere. In agriculture, reducing the sources of greenhouse gases first is reducing the use of fossil fuels. Okay, so whether it's in farming practices, tractors, pickups, trucks, and so on, to the extent that we can move from using fossil fuels for that to using, electricity generated from wind, or perhaps solar, or perhaps nuclear, that is one aspect of how we can reduce fossil fuels. How we can reduce greenhouse gases coming from agriculture. Another part of that is some of the products that we use in agriculture also require fossil fuels for production, whether it's fertilizers or pesticides, herbicides, insecticides. Often those involve the use of fossil fuels as well. Nitrogen fertilizer in particular, you're really, driving the oxidation process, breaking down molecular nitrogen into plant usable forms takes a lot of energy. And so is there a way for us to do that in some way other than using, say, natural gas? So those are all ways that we might be able to reduce sources of greenhouse gases. In addition, methane, remember, methane has about 80 to 100 times the effectiveness as carbon dioxide in retaining that heat in the atmosphere. So can we reduce the emissions of methane from waste? Well, how, so manure or a breakdown of plant tissues, biomass, and that kind of thing. Methane results from conditions. So normally, plant material that's decomposing, it's mostly going to be decomposing in an aerobic environment. So that's not going to produce methane. It will produce carbon dioxide, but producing carbon dioxide is better than producing methane. However, where we have an opportunity to really make some difference is with respect to animal waste. So manure management in particular. And of course, historically, manure was a source of nutrients. All that organic matter in the manure also held nutrients that are important for plant production, nitrogen, phosphorus, and so on. And so historically, we used manure as a soil amendment to get organic matter back in the soil, and with that, then the nutrients. However, for large-scale animal production systems, there's an opportunity to use that manure in a different way that actually we can use to reduce the production of methane, or reduce the release of methane. So basically, what it means is taking the manure and causing it to decompose under a controlled anaerobic environment, what we call an anaerobic digester. And so actually, this is some practice that's very common in wastewater. So sewage treatment plants, many of them will use this, where they create an anaerobic environment. The organic matter goes through a breakdown process by bacteria that function in that anaerobic environment, and the end product of that decomposition is methane. If you do that in a controlled environment, in a closed environment, then you can trap that methane and bleed it off and use it as a heat source, for example, by combustion. And so the use of anaerobic digesters is one way of using the waste to generate energy. You can use it for heat, you can use it for electricity by combusting the methane, and you're still resulting in release of carbon dioxide. I mean, the carbon is there, it's going to be released, but at least it's being released as carbon dioxide instead of as methane, so it has less of an impact on the atmosphere. And at the same time, then we have substituted methane in that case for a fossil fuel. And so we're basically recycling carbon that's already in the system rather than taking carbon out of the ground that's been there for millions of years and releasing that in the atmosphere as we do when we extract oil or gas or coal and then burn that. So that's one opportunity. Another is reduction of methane emissions from ruminants. And this is one that gets a lot of attention and a lot of misinformation. But the fact is, ruminants, cows, deer, bison, sheep, goats, they have a very complex gastric system that you've heard of, the 4 chambers of the stomach, the 4 sections of the stomach in a ruminant. What makes that special is a ruminant has, in that complex stomach, they have the ability to maintain a culture of microbes that operate in a fermentation process that takes the very complex, very indestructible polysaccharide of cellulose, which makes up the cell wall of plants. Those microbes, through the fermentation process, can break that cellulose down into simpler polysaccharides or monosaccharides that then can be used by the animal, taken in, through their gut, through the intestine, into their blood, and then used, as a source of energy for their metabolism. So it's a tremendous adaptation, really a fascinating result of evolution over millions and millions of years. So here's the deal: when they do that fermentation in their stomachs, that results in the release of methane. Some of the carbon that's broken down from the cellulose, some of that carbon is released in the form of methane, and they regurgitate it, or they burp it. It does come out the front end. Everyone talks about cow farts. That's not the problem. The methane's coming out the front end. And so, is there a way we can reduce the amount of methane that's coming out of the rumen of cattle and sheep and goats and bison? And so there's some really interesting research that's going on around that right now. One of the things, for example, we find is that cattle, we have like 91 million head of cattle in the United States currently. That's the current census, 91 million. It's a lot of cattle. We don't really know, but historically or prehistorically, there were probably about 30 million bison, American bison, on the Great Plains. Okay, probably about 40 million white-tailed deer on the North American continent, maybe about 10 million mule deer, and then fewer and fewer of the other ruminants. So today we have about 90 million cattle. When those cattle or bison are feeding on grass, they're very efficient. No, we can't use that grass. Our digestive system can't do anything with cellulose other than pass it through. We call it fiber, but we're not getting any nutritive value out of that. Cattle do. When they're feeding on grass, they produce more methane than when they're feeding on what we call a mixed ration diet. So, for example, in a feedlot, when we're feeding cattle on grains, corn, sorghum, and perhaps a mixture of other sources, cottonseed hulls, for example, are a source of protein that are mixed into animal feeds. When they're feeding on that, they don't produce as much methane as they do when they're feeding on regular grasses. And it's not that surprising, because giving them a grain, a kernel of corn, there isn't cellulose there, right? You've got a polysaccharide, but that one's an easy one to break down. Doesn't require the fermentation process like the cellulose does. So that's why we have that. Well, what we found is a couple of factors can influence how much methane is being produced there. One is genetics. Not only between species or between breeds, but even within a breed. What we're finding is there's tremendous genetic variation within a breed from one animal to another, from one cow to another, in how much methane she produces from fermentation of the same product as another cow of the same breed. Okay, so there's a genetic aspect of how much methane they produce. Well, we can selectively breed. If we can identify the traits, that we can identify the marker that goes with that, then, we can perhaps do some selective breeding in order to have more efficient cattle that produce less methane. The other thing is, and so ration affects it and genetics affect it as well. So that's something to keep in mind in terms of trying to reduce greenhouse gases. In terms of adding to sinks of greenhouse gases, we can store carbon in biomass. And so there's a lot of interest in, what is the credit card? For every time you swipe that credit card, they plant a tree. Well, that's great because, that tree, any plant is going to take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and store it in a more complex way so that it doesn't have the effect on climate that the gas does. That's great, as long as you don't harvest that tree, or burn it, or at least prolong burning it. So if it's a redwood, or the sequoia, giant sequoia, maybe it waits 6, 8, 10,000 years before that carbon is released back to the atmosphere. But, not in geological time, it doesn't. Storing carbon in soil, also another opportunity for us to, at least in the short term, on the order of hundreds to thousands of years, take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere by storing it in the soil. And what we do is we store it as organic matter. And so there's a lot of interest in soil, in farming practices now, and livestock management practices that result in a net addition of organic matter into the soil. The organic matter has the carbon in it, and that stays bound in a complex way if we can slow or stop the decomposition process that would otherwise release that carbon back to the atmosphere. So there's a lot of interest in that now in storing carbon. And there's also, going back to that profitability thing that I mentioned earlier, if we create a market, and there is one now, if they're carbon market, if we can figure out how to monetize that, so when a farmer uses a addition of carbon to the soil, can that farmer get paid for that? So just as they get paid for producing a grain of wheat, can they also get paid for taking a ton of carbon out of the atmosphere and storing it in their soil and keeping it there? So there's a lot of interest in the carbon markets as well. There are other solutions as well, taking, concentrating carbon dioxide, capturing it at combustion, for example, and then injecting it into geological formations so that it's there for, perhaps millions of years. So those are all some of the things that we think about in climate smart agriculture. Let me move on to One Health. So One Health is really this recognition, and I'd go to the final point there, but first, it really is a matter of trying to achieve optimal health outcomes for humans and for the environment that we depend upon. The animals, both domesticated and wild, the plants, the ones that we're growing, the ones we're not growing, all of those have some status of health. And is there a way to achieve optimal health outcomes for the people in the system, as well as the parts of the system that lead to optimal health for people? So One Health is simply a way of talking about everyone being involved in this. So it's not just, the public health officer has to be working with physicians and other healthcare professionals, as well as water treatment managers, or farmers, or veterinarians, or public policy officials. That everyone's involved in this, trying to make sure that we have a system, an ecosystem that is functioning to help support optimal health outcomes. So it works at all scales, global down to local. And again, it has this sense of an overall optimal health outcomes. So some of the issues that come into play here: antimicrobial resistant pathogens. There's a lot of concern about pathogens that develop resistance by misuse, poor stewardship of antibiotics in animal production or plant production systems. And the FDA actually has created a pretty a pretty robust system for separating out the use of antimicrobials in agriculture production from those that we use in human health. And so that separation is important. Another aspect that's important is simply to make sure that we're producing new antibiotics. In the same way that we've had this excitement about developing new approaches to vaccines, we need new approaches to antibiotics. Zoonotic diseases, COVID, I don't need to say any more there. Those are obviously issues that relate to both environmental systems as well as human health systems, animal systems, and so on. Vector-borne diseases like malaria and Chagas disease and so on. Really you're working across the ecosystem there. Diseases in food animals that result in food pathogens, some of the E. coli problems that we've had. And then there's also sort of the emotional dimension of this, psychological dimension, that human animal bond that we have with our pets, for example, or our horses. That has a lot of influence on our well-being, our mental well-being. And so being mindful of that is important as well. A veterinarian dealing with horses is also dealing with the horse owner. And if they don't make that connection, they're really missing an opportunity to have a better ultimate outcome. Water contamination is another issue. Finally, just in terms of how does One Health work, it really depends on this cooperation among professionals, healthcare professionals, environment management professionals, agriculturalists, and so on. So it requires communication between all parts, coordinating activities, and collaborating among those as well. So I apologize for rushing there at the end, but I wanted to see if there were any questions. I'm happy to address those. I don't see any in the chat. If you want to follow up with me, my email is there, phone number, cell phone, and so on. Be happy to visit with you further.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Coon. That was incredibly informative. So we'll start off. I see a question coming through the chat. Let's see. Regarding the use of anaerobic digesters, it is my understanding nutrient slurry that must be drained off to maintain that same volume in an anaerobic digester. Can this be used as an effective fertilizer in large-scale agricultural systems, or is it too difficult to convince them to use the slurry instead of other fertilizers?
No, absolutely. The answer to the question is absolutely. You can use that slurry as a soil amendment for fertilizer, because it's still going to have the nutrients there. All you've done is you remove the carbon and the hydrogen, through combusting the methane. And so what's left is still the nitrogen, the phosphorus, the potassium, and all the other micronutrients. They're still in there. So absolutely, that's a valuable amendment to the soil, as long as it hasn't been contaminated with something else. So, for example, there may be some pharmaceuticals in there. For example, if the animal's been treated, if you have some animals that have been treated with antibiotics, for example, for an infection, and usually that waste is diverted off, so you don't end up with that problem. But otherwise, they can absolutely, and they usually will use that in their farming practices. Right now, the cost of nitrogen has more than tripled in the last 5 years, nitrogen fertilizer. And so if you can get nitrogen from some other place that's cheaper, then use it. Or if you can reuse nitrogen, because catch it as ammonia from the manure, then you're saving yourself a lot of money.
All right, thank you, Emma, for that great question. We have one more in the chat. We've got a limited amount of time, but can you comment on how OSU's Ag is approaching PFAS in Ag? Any plans for research or promising potential practices?
That's a great question, and probably doing more of that actually in water sources. So our Water Resource Center has some projects going on looking at sources of PFAS and fates of them in aquatic ecosystems. But I think there are of course studies going on elsewhere. I think we're going to have some of our faculty are going to be looking more into that, particularly in soil and as it's taken up by plants. What's the fate of the PFAS in in those systems. So it's an emerging area and a critical risk for us to be considering.